How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to my conversation with Dr. Kent Wessinger, researcher, CEO, and chief people scientist at Retention Partners. He's also the author of the book Bridges Over Ladders. Last time, Kent introduced us to his research project on millennials, which, as of his last reporting, has had over 53,000 participants from 33 different nations. In this new episode, we're going to ask Kent to apply that research to some of today's most prevailing questions, especially as millennials now begin to step up as their organization's leaders and culture builders. We have this shift in the workforce where larger and larger percentage of the workforce are these zillennials, as we'll call them. At some point in the not too distant future, the baby boomers aren't going to be in the workforce and they aren't even going to be the leaders. It's the zillennials who are going to be the leaders. How will the zillennials lead differently from previous generations when they're leaders, not just the workforce?
And what you just tapped into, I believe, ultimately can be the legacy of baby boomer and Gen X leaders. Mm-hmm. Will we provide, again, I'm going to go back to a clearly defined path of growth and success by listening to that younger workforce when we step out of the workforce? So my legacy will not be a ladder. My legacy probably won't be my accomplishment. My legacy will be that path that I lead for this younger generation to assimilate into leadership. What kind of clearly defined path will I leave for them? And at the same time, will I leave a path that is broad enough with boundaries, but will I leave a path broad enough for this younger generation to put their own stamp on what leadership means, for them to put their own sense of values and directions and build their own bridges that are there? Coming full circle, I see these younger generations as being much more collaborative than I did the older generations inside the workforce. I also see this younger generation, and I think this is there's two pieces to what I'm about to say. I see this younger generation being almost uber transparent inside of the workplace and inside their communities. That transparency leaves the older generations feeling very uncomfortable, i.e. a good example would be mental health and how easy and how fluid the younger generations are about talking about their mental health. Well, the truth of the fact is, even though I feel uncomfortable with it, that's on me. And all of a sudden, now here comes a generation or generations behind that are talking openly, transparently about mental health. And I cannot find fault in that. And so back to your question about what kind of leaders they will be, we see leaders, little older generations, that are focused on the structure in which they lead, the company in which they guide. Has merit, legit, not throwing shade on any of that. But now we see a leadership or a younger workforce that's assimilating into leadership that is driven by more than just the company or the organization or the structure that they lead. They're driven by the well-being of the employees that work for the company. How happy are they? What does their whole life look like? Not just their career look like? Are we helping them enough outside of the building? Because ultimately, when we help them outside of the building, we know they're more productive in the building, but we want a fluid culture inside of our building. So I see a level of transparency and vulnerability building, and this is what I was getting to, building a high level of trust. And I believe the younger generations are driven to develop and lead an organization that is steeped in trust, which is not just confined to career, the ladder, the pot of gold at the end. And I believe they've come to the conclusion that if we can cultivate an environment or a culture, lack of a better way to say, of trust when inside the company or organization, that the outcomes will actually be even greater than they were with the leaders who were driven by the ladder.
So I want to take a step back and think of this in maybe a more longitudinal kind of way. What you've said is that this shift in the way that younger generations look at the world is heavily influenced by technology, in the sense that we all have access to the same information. We're all influenced by largely the same things across the globe. So it's not a local, regional kind of thing. Do you think that, if you were to look over, instead of a 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 year period, we were to look over 100 or 150 year period and look at more macro trends, is this a wave that you think will change? Is this just a period of time in it, or is this something that's developing and will continue to grow in this direction? In other words, sometimes when you look at a trend in a short period of time, it looks different than if you were to look at it a much larger period of time. Do you think? So how do you see that from that perspective?
I'll start by throwing something out that makes people very uncomfortable.
Sure.
And I may have said this to you, but I didn't start here, by the way, but I am here now. I'm convinced that when we look back 50 years from now, 100 years from now, that we will look at millennials as being one of the greatest generations in organizational history, not Gen Z, but millennials. And the reason for that is because they reconstituted some structures that were by every definition defined as absolute. They challenged them in ways that our structures have never been challenged before. And so what they've done is they've altered the paradigm, which ultimately alters the path of growth and success. And so I don't believe we can put that genie back in the bottle. I believe that the train track has been shifted to another train track, and now the train is running on that track and no more, to the track that we were on. And so, yes, I believe when we look back 100 years, we're going to look at this moment in time as saying there was a generation that altered the path of not only growth and success, but altered the way that we led, altered the way that we related, that moved away from a little bit of a selfish mindset into a collaborative mindset. I believe those are going to continue to play out. And the only other caveat or piece of information that I can bring into that is that in the research project, even though I'm speaking of Zillennials as one group, I do have them segmented in the research project, and even quadrant in this research project. And what I know from this, that all quadrants of Gen Z look at millennials with a very high level of respect, almost to the point where they realize that someone had to go out and do the dirty work for us to get to the place where now we can begin to live like that. And so I believe that's going to continue to grow. Now, will there ever be another shift? Obviously, there will be. But this shift that we've just seen, I believe, is unprecedented. It's unprecedented from a financial perspective. It's unprecedented from an organizational perspective. And does technology have a piece to play there? Obviously, it does.
Sure.
But it could not have happened. It could not have happened without a generation that said, we're going to choose to be at the tip of the spear. That's the only way I believe it could have happened.
Fascinating. Shifting our conversation just a little degree to specifically how that affects culture. So we certainly hear everywhere, everybody knows that the younger generation going into the workforce is much more interested in talking about, so what's the culture of your company? What's that like? Where previous generations, I don't know that was even a conversation. I want to know, how much money do I make and what's the path to advancement? Here, people want to know, and when I say advancement there, I mean when do I get promoted? Were the kinds of things people were interested in before. Today, most younger people are asking potential employers, so what's the culture like there? So what should smart leaders know or be doing to attract these? We'll talk about attraction, then we'll talk about retention, but what should leaders be doing to create the kind of environment that is attractive to the younger workforce that's entering the workforce today?
Obviously, we're all creatures of repetitive habit. And it's one of the reasons I applaud you for the mission that you're on, because you are breaking a lot of those habits and you're deconstructing them and you're replacing them with very healthy habits. One of those deconstructive habits that especially older leaders have when they go into, whether it be a college or university or trade school or even a high school to recruit, many of them are still they're mired in the same behavioral pattern of, this is what we can pay you, these are the benefits that we can give you, and we just go straight down that line instead of recruiting with, this is the culture that we have, this is the clearly defined path of growth and success that we have, and these will potentially be the outcomes in your life. Instead of recruiting with those things, we're continuing to recruit with pay and benefits. I've got about probably, I'd just roughly say 20 plus leaders now that are going into institutions, again, of all levels of education, that are only recruiting with their culture, are only recruiting with the emerging leader structure that I developed. And when they are recruiting with those things, almost every time, I can't really put a metric to it, but almost every time they will call me and say, we just walked out with the top talent that was, on the table there. Because what you just said is so astute, is that the younger workforce sees the totality of their life, the wholeness of their life as being critical, to their career. And they do not see a delineation between the two. They just see life. They don't see career and life. And so when there's a great culture that's going to feed into my life and make my life better, not only in the building, but at home, in the community, in my house of worship, on and on and on, that's a culture. That's a pathway that I want to participate in and I want to grow and live in. And so attract top talent, culture, clearly defined path of growth and success. I can't say that any more emphatically.
Cool. And so let's talk about, so now I've got these people on board. What are the things from a retention standpoint, now that they're here? I'm sure they're similar, but what are the key things I should be focused on if I'm a leader of a company to retain these people who I've just brought in?
I want to go to the emerging leader structure that I developed, and because that's the solution that I've seen make the most difference in retention. The emerging leader structure has 4 central components that are all about retention, but we could even argue engagement and also attraction. Those 4 components are a clearly defined path of growth and success, where the first component is learn, teach foundational leadership lessons. And here's the key part, that are relevant to what's going on in the real world. I even argue a lot of times that the learning component of the emerging leader structure, a central component, is to unlearn what many of them have learned in colleges and universities. For an example, and I may have said this to you before, David, and it got me in trouble, that when I was teaching at the university and I got to choose the classes that I would teach classes where all of the students were graduating with that semester. And I would tell them the first thing of every class, my role in your life over the next 16 weeks is to undo all the theoretical BS that you've learned in the last 3.5 years and serve as a bridge to help you understand what's really going to happen out there in the real world. We all know how many employers and leaders have said, I'm hiring a kid out of Villanova, or I hate to pick on Villanova, but anywhere, I'm hiring a kid out of any college or university, and I'm having to retrain them for 2 years before they get to the place of the level of productivity. So we have to have a structure that has a learning component of foundational leadership lessons. Then it has to have a component of growth, of whole life growth. We've already talked about that. I see that as in a small group, iron sharpens iron mentorship perspective. The third one is that the first one, learn. The second one, growth. The third one, test. And this one that makes people a little bit uncomfortable. I've noticed a couple of concerns with seasoned baby boomer leaders in the last 5 years. And one is they're growing more and more timid about holding the younger workforce accountable. And that is legit, because they know that the cost and the expense of replacing them if they leave. That's the first thing. The other concern that I see is that intensity and moments of intensity are what position us with a culture of confidence, of knowing I'm certain of the outcome of that employee or those that group of employees or that team of employees, because they've already had to navigate some intense moments. They've been tested. And because they've been repetitively tested, I'm confident and secure in the outcome. But I've noticed, and this gets a little bit, again, uncomfortable for some leaders, but I've noticed that seasoned leaders have replaced intensity with sensitivity. And when we lead from a position of sensitivity and remove intensity from the environment, we're very uncertain about the outcomes, and we create an environment of uncertainty. So our emerging leader structure: learn, grow, which is whole life; test, which is moments of intensity, which they're intentional. And the last one is success, where we put people in a position where they take a concept and they turn it into revenue, not just from a theoretical perspective, but from a real life working perspective. We keep people on that track for 3 years. What we know is when they get on the track and they're learning, they're growing, and they're seeing success, they don't want to leave the company or organization because it's been clearly defined for them. They know where they're going. They recognize who is investing in them, and they see the potential outcomes that are in front of them. So hypothetically, if they begin to look to the right or the left, if they look to pasture, greener pasture somewhere, supposed greener pastures, they're looking over there and they do not see a clearly defined path of growth and success. They don't see a culture that is cultivating growth and success. They see a culture that is concerned. They're in a confident culture and they want to remain in that confident culture. So retention is contingent on that clearly defined path of growth and success.
Cool. So I'm going to shift the conversation to a sort of, I'm going to call it a mundane issue. It feels mundane, but yet this is coming up everywhere. I know you hear it. I hear it everywhere. And it relates to this whole topic. And that is whether people, the whole return to work, whether we're working virtually or working in the office. And I hear so many leaders that feel like they're struggling with this dilemma of, on one level, giving my staff the ability to work anywhere they want, however they want, and being flexible feels like a really good thing. And it helps people have more of a whole life. And at the same time, I hear so many leaders feeling like, we definitely feel like we've lost productivity here, that people aren't learning from each other because they're not together. They're not building the same kinds of bonds they were if they were together. They're not overhearing the conversation that the guy next to me had that would have led to a good conversation about how to help clients or whatever else. And they're really struggling with, how do we find the right balance between the things we feel like we've lost because people aren't together, and yet wanting to be flexible enough to allow people to work however they want to work? Where do you come down on that based on your research and what you've learned?
The metrics in the research show us that 52% of baby boomers and Gen X, 52% say the place that has the highest level of productivity and efficiency for me to work from is in the building. So 52%, that leaves 48% by
I know, exactly. That's a tough place to be when it's half and half.
But 45% of Millennials say the most productive and most efficient place for me to work is also in the building. And so I'm not seeing a great divide here. And I believe this divide has been propagated by, whether it be media outlets, whatever. But I know there's some
makes for a better story.
Yeah, it does. But I do know there's some legitimacy associated with it. But I continue to go back to a couple of key factors. The younger workforce thrives in a collaborative environment. I'm also seeing in the metrics where the most effective method or channel of communication with the younger workforce, in other words, they're communicating this. They're communicating in the research that the most effective and efficient way to communicate is face-to-face. And we're seeing that metric continue to grow. That can't happen if we're working from home.
Yep.
And I asked that question from 5 different perspectives so that I can get a full understanding of it. And the metric in all of those places is continuing to grow. And then I will say maybe the most important factor goes back to that mental health issue. And we also know, especially where we have small groups, whole life small groups functioning inside the building, inside the culture, where people are able to communicate and talk about some of the issues that they're having to navigate through life. We're also seeing not just incrementally, exponentially increase in healthy mental health rates inside the building. But that does not happen if they're remaining at home. And so the solution to that, it's always going to be a difficult piece. I really believe when this all settles out, if the job allows it, remember, not all jobs allow that.
Sure.
If the job or the career allows it, I do believe that it's going to settle out in some type of hybrid model. And I believe that hybrid model, we're going to see that play out with, especially as millennials assume the leadership positions. I believe that hybrid model is going to win the day. I don't believe that stay at home is going to win the day. And I'm not certain that be at work all the time is going to win the day. I really do believe that hybrid model is going to win out.
It makes sense. I mean, there's so many benefits to each that you hate to give up all for one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this has been a fascinating conversation, Ken. As we kind of wrap up our conversation, one of the things I'm always interested for anybody in any role is I'm always curious about, I always like to ask people about kind of the lessons learned in life, the wisdom they've gained over time. And so I guess the way I would position that with you is before you started, if you can even remember, before you started doing this research, I imagine you had some hypotheses about, whether stated or unstated, about what you thought the research would tell you. And I'm curious whether you've documented those or can remember them. What do you think today that's different from what you thought before you did the research? So you had some points of view about people, the world before that research, and now informed by that research, you say, man, was I wrong? I have a whole different view of that. What are the biggest differences?
I had to completely relocate to a different camp, David. and the relocation was this. I lived in the same camp of which many, many older people did. I was observing what I felt were entitled, lazy, selfish generation.
Okay.
And the research unpacked to me that we are leading a generation that's the most creative, collaborative, opportunistic generation that we've ever witnessed. And so smart, I can go on, and innovative. There's just so many characteristics there. It does not happen without a great culture that, facilitates that. I will say that. And so maybe the biggest lesson is that I don't have to be concerned, because I was in the concerned camp about what's coming down the pike, because I, like a lot of people, had bought into this mindset. I know this is a little bit extreme, that are all of these younger generations living in their parents' basement. And I've discovered that all of that is not, that it's just nonsense. Is there a degree of that? Yeah, but it's so minute. It's absurd. So I've had to move from the concerned camp to I'm in the confident camp right now about this generation. And I've already alluded to, I think that millennials will be the greatest generation in organizational history when we look back. And I'm confident about that. And look, I'll close that on a story an interview that I did just recently that really rocked me. The former prime minister of Israel, his name is Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett said that prior to October the 7th, he also saw the younger generations, is entitled, lazy. He even used the word soft. They're soft. They're educatedly soft. But on October the 7th, he saw something. He saw that what he defined as a soft generation not run from the fight, but run to the fight. And they ran to the fight for the greater good. He saw a level of courage that he had never seen before, while his own generation were lined up at the airport, couldn't wait to get on the airplane to get out of the country. And so he said, the conclusion that I came to after witnessing the courage from the younger generation was that we have a nation of lions. But if we sit around And we judge as soft, but we don't have environments that will test, grow, produce. We don't really realize that we have a nation of lions. I'm convinced of this. Every organization that I go into, I see an employee base of lions, of hungry lions who are waiting to grow. And so no longer am I concerned. I'm confident. That was a lot to answer that one question, but I'm confident about what's ahead. I'm not concerned about what's ahead with this younger generation leading not only our organizations, but our nation and the world. I'm confident. And good outcomes, awesome. Healthy outcomes.
That's awesome. So Ken, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you joining me. Tell for our audience, if they want to learn more about your research, about the work you do, I know that you work with lots of employers, helping them to develop strategies for attracting and retaining this younger generation. Where would people find out more about your work?
They can at retentionpartners.com. First, Dr. Kent Wessinger at gmail.com. Reach out to me. I'm all over YouTube. All over LinkedIn. I would probably say the healthiest place, the most effective place is just go to my LinkedIn profile, Dr. Kent Wessinger, send me a message. We can make something happen from there. And as I have continued to push forward in helping leaders not only solve, maybe the most important point is position that younger workforce for sustainable growth and help them develop a clearly defined path of growth and success. I would say that my mission has boiled down to one thing, is creating growth for young leaders. And that's my mission inside every company and organization, that emerging leader structure that has those components that will produce growth among young leaders that ultimately benefits the company and the older leaders themselves.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Kent. Appreciate you joining us on Culture Architects.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
And that's it for this episode of Culture Architects with Dr. Kent Wessinger, researcher, CEO, and chief people scientist at Retention Partners, and author of the book Bridges Over Ladders. Folks, if you've been enjoying what we do on this show, make sure to subscribe, and that way you'll get automatic updates on my latest episodes and guests. And if you have a minute, I'd love it if you left us a review, and that way more culture fans like you can discover the show. And lastly, if you want to learn more about building a high-performing culture in your organization or team, check us out at CultureWise.com. See you next time on Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.